Can I just start by, first of all, saying thank you to Ina and Serge for your kind invitation to attend this conference. I've really learned a lot from meeting new colleagues and hearing about different perspectives, I guess, on some of the questions we're asking ourselves about the region in the Pacific on the subject of gender. Can I just quickly also say thank you to all the ESEP staff for their wonderful and generous assistance. It's really made everything so much easier for us, I guess, as non-French speaking people. Although we will promise if we come back we will do better next time and speak French. But in particular, we'd like to say thank you to Yasmina, Louis-Marie, Pierre, Andre, the other IT people. They've been really great to us, so it's very much appreciated. And of course to Olivier, who's not in the room with us, but he's shown incredible professionalism and stamina, I think, as our translator across all these 3 days. Okay, so to my paper, which is focusing principally, as you may have guessed from the title, on the relationship between faith and peace building, and how that's articulated by women activists in the Pacific Islands. And I think that's an important thing for us to understand, and so to support this claim in the presentation I'm giving today, I examined two intersecting sites of this political activity. And the first is women's faith-based efforts to build peace in communal relations and to resist communal violence in Fiji, and faith-based efforts to build peace across the Pacific Islands region, and how faith-based advocacy has been used by women to build a resistance against the issue I'm focusing on is nuclear testing in the region. In presenting this paper in this particular forum, I'm very conscious of the way that I'm using the category women, or the term women, particularly given the close attention we have paid in the last few days to the relationship between language, practice, and possibility when we attach a label to gender. So I want to establish here that I'm attentive to all the discussions we've had in the last few days and the complexity that should be brought to these questions. But I use the term women today in this paper as a political category, focusing specifically on the ways in which faith and politics are linked in women's peace activism in Fiji. Okay. But I want to start quickly by locating this research in a broader debate that's occurring in my field, international relations, international politics. I want to locate this discussion in a debate that's occurring in this field around the question of women's security in global politics. In this slide, I've included images of some of the key figures who are leading this debate from the US-based scholars and senior people within the US State Department, who are really trying to focus new attention on this question of the contributions that women make to global security. The woman at the bottom of the slide, I hope you can all see it. It's not, I should have probably lifted the images up a little, but that's Melanie Vivier, and she's been appointed as the US Global Ambassador for Women. And she's written about the importance of women's participation in peace building. Of course, echoing the earlier work of people like Sarah Ruddock and others who have articulated a strong link between women's maternalism and their peace building capacity. But more spectacular, perhaps, has been the recent intervention into this debate by US-based scholars such as Valerie Hudson and Mary Caprioli, who contend that societies which uphold the rights of women are inherently more peaceful than those societies which tolerate women's subordination. So the focus here is not so much on what women can do as peace builders, but how they are positioned within society, and then how this is indicative of the peacefulness of that society. The argument focuses on the problems in societies that are indicated by high tolerance of gender inequality, or what Hudson and her cohort describe as a gender gap, and the resulting tolerance for more generalized forms of intolerance and violence that this gender gap is said to encourage. Hudson and her co-authors defend this view in the following way. So I'm quoting from Valerie Hudson here. If domestic violence is normal in family conflict resolution in a society, then that society is more likely to rely on violent conflict resolution and to be involved in militarism and war than are societies with lower levels of family violence. The proponents of this theoretical position are so confident of the correlation between gendered insecurity and state insecurity that they advocate a predictive capacity for this scenario, contending that the best predictor of state peacefulness is how well its women are treated. What explains this gender gap, which is the cause of the problem? Hudson and her co-authors explain this as a product of culture. So the culture concept is invoked here as a driver of violence in general and a problem for women in particular. And it's argued that norms of cultural violence diffuse through religion, ideology, and language, stereotyping, and I'm quoting here, women as simple-minded, unable to control their own bodies, and unsuitable for public office. As a feminist scholar of international politics, I celebrate all efforts to focus increased attention on the global status of women. But this construction of a causal relationship between gender discrimination and conflict is deeply problematic in my view. It ignores the fact that gender discriminatory norms and practices are more likely to be inflamed by conflict and a symptom rather than a cause of war and violence. Equally, the view of non-Western women as imprisoned by culture is problematic and long been challenged by third world feminists who have exposed the hegemonic origins of this gaze and the savior narrative that it has encouraged. But even more importantly, this analysis ignores the extent to which women peace builders can find within their culture and faith both the motivation to resist violence and insecurity and sources of broader socio-political legitimation when they undertake this activity. This is something that my work in Fiji has taught me, and I focus particularly today on the place of faith in the politics of peace building and the gendered politics of peace building. I make this claim while of course also conceding that faith can be a source of insecurity in some parts of the Pacific Islands region, and it has been invoked to legitimate violence and violent outcomes. Such discourses can fuel communal aggression, and they have certainly legitimated colonial projects of dispossession. But in this region, to discuss only that would overlook important examples which show where and how faith has also become a vital resource for women peace builders who are resisting violence in intercommunal and interregional contexts. And in the longer version of this paper, I also include a section on how women activists use these type of faith-based discourses and faith-based strategies to also resist conjugal violence, domestic violence, and violence in the family setting. In particular, I want to make the point that believing women are often deeply committed to a transformative and peaceful politics, and that it is insulting to imagine that they are simply blinkered to these possibilities by restrictive norms alleged to be religious in origin. And I talk about faith in this context because I'm not only talking about Christianity. In Fiji, there's a very big Indian population, and so I'm going to be drawing on examples of this type of work being done by Muslim women in Fiji as well. So now let me turn to a more empirical, focused discussion of these ideas. In 2002, so this section of the paper is looking at communal division in Fiji. In 2002, I worked with a group of feminist theologians attached to a Suva-based theological college. They called themselves the Weavers Group, and asked them how a faith-based resistance to violence might take form. My informants discussed notions of Christian personhood and the idea that resistance to violence relied upon a notion of common humanity, Christians recognizing that they belonged to a global moral community. Our commonality is our humanness, one member of this group stated, and something which made it impossible to respond passively to violence in the home, in the community, and in the region. In my work on women and peace building, I found this idea replicated in a variety of contexts. As I began this research some 18 months earlier, an event, sorry, I've got a bit of a problem here with my text. As I began this research, Fiji's communities were still recovering from the impacts of a civilian coup which had occurred some 18 months earlier. An event which resulted in sporadic and uncontrolled outbreaks of civilian violence, and which left a legacy of fear and distrust between Fiji's indigenous and Indian communities. So let me just roll forward. There's some images from this coup in 2000. As you can see, very masculinized images of violence that were circulating in the local and regional media at that time. Since 1987, religion has been used or drawn upon to fuel anti-Indian sentiment, with religious leaders, Christian leaders, often likening Indian faith practices as the activity of evil heathens. However, references to religion have not only been used to foster tension and suspicion between communities in Fiji. There have also been faith-based efforts to bridge the difficult politics of race in Fiji. What I'm showing you here is a recent discovery, although it is well known, I think, in the region, this painting, but I only just found it on my last trip to Fiji this year. And it's a fresco painted by, in the 1960s, by Jean Chalot, a French artist who actually did quite a lot of work in Hawaii, I believe, as well. But he produced this work for a small Catholic church, which is perched on a hill overlooking the village of Naisaralangi in the northern coast of Fiji's main island of Viti-Levu. The fresco is a little forgotten in contemporary Fiji, and when it is remembered, it's because it depicts a black Christ or a Fijian Christ in a tapa cloth. I show it to you today for a different reason, however. When I recently discovered it, I was so struck by the representations of Indo-Fijians in this work. On the left of the fresco, there's a woman in a sari holding out a string of marigolds. And there's also an Indian man driving a cattle plough, also on the left. A bit hard to see, you'll have to focus in if you can. And I thought to myself how much this inclusion of Indians in this Christian representation inside a Christian Catholic church really challenged the contemporary political environment of racial difference. Looking at this fresco in 2013, it seemed to me that in the late 1960s, Shallow had created an image of interfaith sensibility that has a particular salience for the later political environment in Fiji, where racial differences are so hardened and so highly politicized. Shallow's fresco may not be so well remembered by Fijians today, but as I will show, this interfaith sensibility, yoked with a notion of common humanity, lives on. And it's particularly evident in the ways that women peace activists have responded to Fiji's coups and the communal violence that this has sparked. For example, as news of the 2000 coup broke, women from faith communities almost immediately came together to stage a prayer vigil at Suva's Holy Trinity Anglican Cathedral. Dressed in black, women attending the vigil mourned the threat of violence that hung over the nation and expressed the hope that a peaceful resolution might be negotiated. The church vigil became a site for women's resistance to the coup and the violence it had unleashed. But this was not simply a site of Christian resistance. The coordinator of the Fiji Muslim Women's League, Nisha Baksh, was also a member of the organizing council that formed the Peace Vigil, and described to me the personal importance of this event for her in a period when her fellow Muslim community felt particularly vulnerable. And she stated, so I'm quoting, "At this time, everybody was in chaos. We had the feeling that anything could happen at any time. There was the military everywhere and so many guns on the street. People had the feeling that their homes could be raided at any time. The prayer allowed women to meet in one place, to come together and pray for peace. It was about prayer and networking and creating a movement." So, end of quote. The Women's Peace Vigil was held on a monthly basis for some years afterwards, and in fact is still continuing, I learned on my last trip even now. And it became also an important site for future civil society activity, advocating a return to democracy. When I talked to Nisha Baksh, so this is the head of the Muslim Women's League in Fiji, about communalism, perceptions of security, and women's place within Fiji's Islamic community, I found that her words echoed the ideas that feminist Christian theologians had raised about faith providing the basis of a common human experience that could be drawn upon to build a gendered security. Nisha identified common traditions between Islam and Christianity. The practice of wearing a veil, for example, which she stated had also been a part of Christian tradition in earlier times. She reflected on this some more when she remarked, "You know, it's funny, but often I'm driving through a village and the kids will call out, 'Hey, sister,' because they think I'm a nun. They can't see the difference." During our discussions, Nisha was also keen to challenge popular ideas about the gender discriminatory nature of Islam. She stated that Muslim laws talk about equality between men and women all the time. And she also remarked that, I'm quoting again, God had chosen women and men to be in partnership. The Quran says a lot about men and women, not just men, she stated. Nisha had been educated in a Methodist school where she had read the Bible. She said she felt that the story of Mary was far more comprehensively treated in the Quran than the Bible, and something that she said always made her laugh. Perhaps again because it challenged conventional understandings of Islam as discriminatory or gender discriminatory. Some months after I interviewed Nisha, Fiji's Minister for Women, Asanatha Thautha, betrayed her own ethno-nationalist sympathies when she stood in the National Parliament of Fiji. So this is an indigenous Fijian woman, and described Indo-Fijians as, I'm quoting, noxious weeds in the community. I thought back to Nisha's reflections and her observations of faith as it's practiced in Fiji. Nisha seemed keen to make the point that there was far more commonality between Islam and Christianity than was reflected in this type of rhetoric. She was deeply troubled by the attacks made on places of worship, or her community's places of worship, and the ease with which political leaders ruthlessly exploited religious and ethnic divisions for their own political gain. But even so, Nisha's interfaith sensibilities and her efforts to define a common humanity across difference also allowed her to challenge this communal politics with a humour that, despite the seriousness of the times, was highly endearing. And this sympathetic outlook certainly explains why the multi-faith focus of the Peace Vigil program was able to continue for so many months and years after the 2000 coup. Okay, I just want to change the focus now and look at some of the work that has been done by Fiji-based women activists in collaboration with women around the region in resistance to the nuclear testing issue. And we know, of course, that that is an ongoing issue and that communities around the Pacific Islands are living with the ongoing health and environmental impacts of nuclear testing in the region. But I'm going to take us back a little bit into an earlier history of a couple of decades ago. Ideas about faith and common humanity have also underpinned women's efforts to challenge regional insecurities. Let me change the emphasis. Regional insecurities threatening the well-being of Pacific Island peoples. Here I want to examine two brief examples. Resistance to regional nuclear weapons testing, and also thinking about how that has created a kind of a very fertile ground for confronting the new challenges of sea level rise and environmental change in the Pacific. References to Christian faith have been an important part of resistance to nuclear weapons testing. In Fiji, protests against a nuclearized Pacific were led by the local branch of the YWCA in the 1960s, 60s, 70s. An organization which described itself as committed to the promotion of peace and a just world order, assisted by the Christian values of obedience to Jesus and love of fellow men. This faith-based commitment to peace building underpinned the organization's efforts to inform Pacific Island communities about the dangers of nuclear testing and to build support for the anti-nuclear agenda through public meetings, rallies, and community theatre performances. The YWCA, with the assistance of the student Christian movement at the newly formed USP campus, this is in Suva in Fiji in the late 1960s, worked to build support also from within mainline church organizations on this issue, Catholic and Methodist. So by 1974, the Pacific Council of Churches passed a series of resolutions at its annual conference which opposed nuclear testing and advocated the importance of creating a nuclear-free zone in the Pacific. So that's a photo that I retrieved from the archives, the YWCA archives. In later years, the theological dimensions of this nuclear issue were further explored in a book called, entitled A Call to a New Exodus. Here, Fijian anti-nuclear activist and Fiji YWCA member, Suliana Siwotimbao, teamed with co-author David Williams to argue that the divine and intimate, integral relationship between God, humanity, and nature was being irrevocably damaged by nuclear testing in the region. In this publication, the anti-nuclear cause was framed as a peacemaking mission, and Pacific Islanders were encouraged to see themselves as its leaders, ordained to resist the injustice of nuclear weapons testing. Church acceptance of the nuclear issue was decried as a terrible silence and accommodation. That's a quote. It was argued, I'm quoting again, if Christians have lost their role as peacemakers, it is because they have forgotten who they are and because they themselves have fallen victims to the lies and the fears perpetuated by the global powers acting as false gods. End quote. In this way, anti-nuclear campaigners emphasized Christian notions of personhood, where commitments to environmental stewardship, peacemaking, and justice, rather than material arms capability, were seen to underpin oceanic security. In more contemporary periods, this commitment to regional security built around principles of environmental stewardship has found its analogue in the Pacific Conference of Churches' critical scrutiny of global development policy and its implications for climate change in the islands region and the threat of sea level rise, or impending threat of sea level rise. Here, the Pacific Council of Churches takes issue with neoliberal notions of personhood, which define the individual as a maximizer, I'm quoting here, maximizer of material goods and the sum total of all his or her wants. And the PCC publicity releases, press releases state, these ideas are seen to be, I'm quoting, grossly inadequate to achieving the kind of peace and security that Pacific people know and wish for. And I see that notion of environmental stewardship that was really lay at the heart of that earlier era of anti-nuclear activism informing this new second wave of environmental and faith-based activism around climate change and the challenges of climate change. Okay, I hope what I've shown here is that while religion has been used to validate violence that is racialized or colonial, or from colonial sources in the Pacific Islands, women activists also see within their faith plenty of resources that can be mobilized to challenge these things. But before we over-romanticize this scenario, I want to finish with a note of circumspection. For many women in Fiji, they have also lamented the secondary status of women in the church. And as one Fijian intellectual has described it, one woman intellectual, female intellectual, the fact that, I'm quoting, Pacific women sweep the church but never speak from the pulpit. While we can look at these religiously informed challenges to local systems of race discrimination or geopolitical power as being promoted in ways that have a correspondence with Pacific Islands sociocultural values, we also need to understand how these prevailing values and belief systems shape the public space available to women activists. Certainly, these strategies can be viewed as creative, as Margaret Joly has argued. But this does not erase the patriarchal norms and practices that are also heavily bound up with religious observance. Does this undermine the broader transformational potential of this type of advocacy? It's a question Sally Mary poses in her writing about human rights, about how human rights values are translated in local contexts. And it's a question that I have spoken to women activists in Fiji about. And they ask themselves regularly these types of questions. Are they giving too much territory away, particularly in political contexts where religion and ethno-nationalism is very strongly linked? Are they giving too much territory away by invoking social, religious, cultural norms that are highly valued by the Indigenous nationalists? Thanks, Nicole. So just to give some examples of what that looks like, that the yoking of nationalist, ethno-nationalist political discourse and religious discourse. In 1987, Sitiveni Rambuka made a jest, a very famous jest in Fiji now, that Fijians use the Sabbath to kick either a football or one's wife around. A particularly unfortunate illustration of this trend, I guess also signalling the importance of rugby in Fiji as well. This rhetoric has been much more muted under the current military government, which has sought to restrict the public political profile of Fiji's Methodist Church, which is the most important in the country. Although I'll note that this hardly represents a gain for women who in Fiji who are now living within a highly militarized government. When appraised in this light, it can therefore be seen that women advocates' references to religion may increase their political traction at one level, yet these strategies may also reflect underlying currents which shape and to some extent restrict the conduct of Fiji's civil society organisations. So how do I resolve these tensions in my work? I've thought long and hard about this, and I'm convinced that the potential for a transformational politics remains even when these types of restrictions are acknowledged. So to work my way through what I've described what I call an encompassed agency. Again, developing on ideas put forward by Margaret Joly in the early 1990s and later by Holly Wardlow in mid-2000s, to capture the idea that women's agency is shaped by things like religion and culture in Fiji. But this does not foreclose the possibility of a transformational politics also being expressed, something that I'm quite confident is occurring in Fiji when women speak about security in a language that also draws on their faith traditions. Thank you.